Today I will be preaching about examples. My base verse today is 1 Timothy 4:12. Do not let anyone look down on you because you are young, but set an example for the believers in speech, conduct, love, faith, and in purity. This is what Paul writes to Timothy because he was a young preacher at the time and needed encouraged. So don't let anyone look down on you because you're young, but set an example for the believers. Might be easy to say, I'm young. People won't listen to me. People won't follow my example. My example doesn't matter. But as young followers of Christ, we have the best opportunities to show good Christ-like examples to all. Paul tells us to be examples in speech. If we use foul language or talk ill about other people, talk behind their backs, what example does that leave? Instead, use our speech for building others up, for encouraging others, for spreading God's word for others to hear. Paul also tells us to be an example in conduct. Conduct is how you behave. If you act with a mean spirit by putting others down, this is not setting a good example in conduct. Instead, put others before you just as Jesus did. Paul also tells us that we can set a good example and should set a good example in love. We can set a good example in love by caring for our friends, for our families, by spreading joy, by being a light, and by showing the love we have in Jesus Christ every single day. Paul tells us to be examples in faith. In a lot of Bible stories about faith, the person chooses faith over what they want. Faith takes sacrifice. Faith isn't easy, but it is so important because people will see that example we leave in faith. Finally, Paul tells us to set examples in purity. It says in 2 Timothy 2:22, flee also youthful lusts, but follow righteousness, faith, charity, peace, and with it that call out of a pure heart. The devil will tempt us with situations, unclean thoughts, but if we flee from them, as Timothy says, we are setting a good example in purity. Now, I just talked about what Paul tells us to be examples in, okay? But how do we know what the perfect example is? Well, Jesus Christ came down to earth in a human form and set the perfect example. The perfect example in forgiving, perfect example in loving, the perfect example in caring. Let's look at some of Jesus' examples. Jesus' example in loving. It says in 1 John 3:16, this is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. Now, every single day as Christians, we don't need to literally lay down our life. But we can lay down our lives in our comfort, our pride, our time. Of the many things said and done by Jesus, his example in love was the most impressionable. When we show love for God, for our neighbors, for our outsiders, for outcasts, even for our enemies, we show a good Christ-like example. Jesus had an example in suffering. It says in 1 Peter 2:21, for to this you were called because Jesus Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that we should follow in his steps. Following Jesus' example is not always going to be easy, and it shouldn't be easy, especially when it comes to suffering. No one wants to suffer for someone who's done them wrong, for someone who you don't think deserves it. But Jesus Christ came down to earth and suffered for all of us. He was nailed to the cross for us, and he says that we should do the same. Christ's example in prayer. Matthew 6:5-6, and when you pray, do be not like the hypocrites, for they like to pray standing at the synagogues and on the street corners. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father, who sees what is done in secret. When you pray, you're praying to your Father, not to be seen by others, not to be a show-off, but to pray to him for forgiveness for redemption, for guidance. Christ's example in forgiving. Again, this is another category of Christ's examples which is not always easy, just as suffering is. It's not easy to forgive someone. Colossians 3:13 says, "Forbearing one another and forgiving one another, if any man have a quarrel against another, even as Christ forgave you, so also do you." It says, even as Christ forgave us, something he did not need to do, but he still did. So also do ye. So as Christians following this example, so also do we need to forgive others. 1 Corinthians 11:1, follow the examples of Christ as I follow them. For Christians, setting a good Christ-like example is an everyday opportunity to highlight Jesus' love. Even if we are young, we can still set a good example. The example that Jesus Christ showed us in the New Testament.
All right.